I wrote it all out. Well, not all of it, but enough. For it isn't enough to talk about peace. One must believe in it. And it isn't enough to believe in it. One must work at it. Eleanor Roosevelt. First and foremost, it isn't enough to talk or read or listen about anti-racism. One must work at it. For context, I was born and raised in Bellingham. I graduated from Bellingham High School and attended Western and earned a degree in special and elementary education. I didn't consider myself to be a racist person, but I was, not yet, an anti-racist. I grew up in a system that worked for me, was designed for me to succeed, and succeed I did. I believed that if you worked hard, you'd earn the reward. This system, though, rewards the cisgendered, heteronormative, white, able-bodied man, and most women fairly well. Anti-racist work is rooted in learning the deep, embedded systems that were designed to systematically keep Black, brown, indigenous, people of color down. And then we must work at disrupting the system. When I started teaching in Minneapolis, August of 2013, I made so many mistakes as a teacher and as a human. The ultimate measure of a person is not where one stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where one stands in times of challenge and controversy. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I made mistakes because I stayed where I was comfortable and where it was convenient. Edison High School was the host site for the Northeast Minneapolis barbecue at the end of August. The event provided food to the neighborhood and also took place during Edison's open house, a prime opportunity to meet students and build community. I saw my colleagues interact with students, mix, mingle, and of course they knew some of these students from previous years. Being new, I was nervous. And honestly, I'd never been around so much diversity and seen so many BIPOC people, like ever. I worked at Edison High School, a 100-year-old school in Northeast Minneapolis that once served the Polish immigrant community. Northeast Minneapolis was a lower middle-class neighborhood, but most Caucasian families sent their children to the neighboring suburban school or the private school in the area, leaving Edison to serve the growing Latinx and Somali immigrant populations and the overflow of North Minneapolis's urban Black neighborhood, because Northeast was safer. Edison students were 88% BIPOC, mostly African American or Black, followed by Latinx, Indigenous, and some Hmong, although the larger Hmong community is in St. Paul. So who do I approach? The white kids with the rainbow pride pins on their backpacks, diversity I was comfortable with. My special education classes were not places of great challenge or controversy because I kept myself comfortable. I was the overly encouraging teacher, the cheerleader, and the borderline cringy white savior lady that is often displayed in movies. My scholars and I kept things fairly surface level. They were smart. Keep me happy, they got more snacks. The challenge came when the realities of being a young Black person in North Minneapolis were gunned down. I had learned enough of the reality of my students, one of whom asked if he could still turn in an assignment, even though it had blood on it from when he was stabbed after a football game by a rival gang, to know that if I stayed teaching at Edison long enough, I'd lose a student. I didn't think I'd lose a student my first year. There was 1 week of school left. My 6th hour was supposed to be me and Nemo. Nemo never came to class on Monday. He had been shot and killed on Sunday. 6th hour became a place where other students came to cry, to make posters, memorialize Nemo, to escape. The challenge? They weren't in class, and the controversy was I was allowing them to skip class. Education is a system, and when students needed the safety of school the most, The system was literally failing them and keeping them down. How could Armisha focus on her algebra final when her best friend was killed in the streets? Clearly, work needed to be done. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Desmond Tutu. Fast forward a few years, fall of 2016. As a teacher, we are explicitly told to keep politics out of the classroom. Teach critical thinking, remain neutral. And although I agree as an educator I should teach critical thinking, I should not force my beliefs upon others. But on the night of November 8th, 2016, I realized that neutrality was no longer an option. Intent versus impact. What seems like a good intention may not lead to a good impact. And oftentimes, this is the downfall of white people with good intentions. Because we do things that make us feel better. That toxic positivity. On November 9th, roughly 30 white teachers, my colleagues, were greeting students as they came to school. Cheering, in fact. I was up in my classroom because I had a first hour English class and often had students eat their breakfast in my room. One of those was Fanta. So sweet, soft-spoken, and an absolute delight. Her and her family were Liberian immigrants and practicing Muslims. Instead of smiling at me that morning, Fanta looked at me with daggers in her eyes. Behind the absolute rage and anger was utter sadness. My smartass self made some sassy comment and Fanta exploded. You're all fucking happy he won. You all voted for Trump. Whoa. I mean, I was 100% used to being sworn at daily, but oh shit. Those well-intended, overly positive colleagues of mine who were outside cheering, the Black, brown, immigrant, Muslim, refugee students, didn't think we were cheering because they came to school. They thought a bunch of white people were celebrating Trump's presidential victory. How was I supposed to remain neutral and make Fanta feel safe? Make Jose feel safe knowing his family didn't have citizenship? Make Elena feel safe, who recently came out as transgendered? Slowly, with looks of defeat, my first hour juniors came to room 314. We talked about the election and the importance of voting. I said that when I vote for candidates who support education, women's rights, and civil rights. There was a collective sigh of relief. Neutrality was no longer an option, as a clear ideological war was taking over and systems of oppression were fast in motion, gaining confidence. That year, I lost count of the numbers of emails sent from social workers or counselors asking for suitcases, students having older family members deported, or gift cards because the deported family members were the ones who had the jobs and were financially supporting the families. Black Lives Matter simply refers to the notion that there's a specific vulnerability for African Americans that needs to be addressed. It's not meant to suggest that other lives don't matter. It's to suggest that other folks aren't experiencing this particular vulnerability. Barack Obama. To counteract the rise of political oppression, the emboldened hate speech, and the rise in police violence that was taking over the country was the Black Lives Matter movement. How was I, as a white-bodied teacher, supposed to teach, empower, and give my students a sense of positive identity? Books! Sounds simple. Too simple. I started with Dear Martin by Nick Stone, Black female author from Atlanta. Her book intertwined the life of a young Black man, Justice, from the rough side of Atlanta who attends an affluent boarding school, with letters to MLK as Justice begins to process the systems of racial oppression and superiority that surrounds him. The book starts out with Justice being an honorable young man, trying to get his intoxicated ex-girlfriend, who was light-skinned and white passing, home from a party. In less than 5 pages of the book, Justice is lying on the ground in handcuffs and being demeaned by the cops. And my students are royally pissed off at me for springing this trauma on them, although they didn't have the words to express that. So they shut down and said they didn't want to read the stupid book. Again, I wasn't acknowledging their vulnerability. I was being challenged by my students, and rightfully so. I had to sit with my discomfort and reflect on what I was asking of them. I was asking them to be vulnerable, raw, relive trauma that I had never experienced in my life as a white person. Damn, I wasn't as woke as I thought I was. I could have brushed it all under the rug, so to speak, not acknowledge my actions or lack of thought, move on because I have the power in the classroom as the teacher. That would have upheld the system of oppression, dismissed their feelings, and dehumanized my students even more. So the next day, I went back to my classes and I apologized. I apologized for triggering trauma, for having an authoritative power over them, for being ignorant of their vulnerability. How could I expect them to be vulnerable when I wasn't? Part of anti-racist work is acknowledging your power and your privilege. So I did that. I acknowledged that I had the privilege of never being scared of cops or worried someone would shoot me because I was wearing a hoodie and carrying a bag of Skittles. I may not know what racial trauma is, but I know trauma. And that's where I started over and reteaching. This particular group of students knew I had a messed up heart because word does get around school, but they didn't know how deep the impact that physical trauma of multiple open heart surgeries and scars left. I opened up about my trauma, drawing connections on how trauma affects those directly impacted by the event and those who witness it. I was vulnerable and opened up my heart deeper to my students, allowing them to do the same. We talked about covert and overt racism, how privilege came into play, like when TSA once invited me to go through the security line intended for airline crew members. When I looked around the airport, I realized everyone around me was Latinx or Indigenous. I was the only blonde-haired, blue-eyed person, clearly not a threat. Dear Martin allows Justice to process his thoughts through journal writing. So that's what we did. We journaled. Everyone picked a person, dead or alive, who they knew or didn't know, to write and process the thoughts they had. Again, I told my students, I may not know what systematic racism is from personal experience, but I had a great mentor in my life who taught me early on what hate, prejudice, and bigotry can do when it goes unchecked. So of course, my journal was titled, Dear Noemi. We discussed the parallels between policing and slavery in America to Nazi prison camps and the horrors Noemi experienced in Auschwitz and Buchenwald. Both systems intelligently designed to keep certain people down. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Elie Wiesel. The next step was to uplift, to give power and agency to the voices of my students. They wrote letters to the Minneapolis Police Department. I posted some of their thoughts on Facebook. I could no longer be silent, and I had the privilege of using my voice without fear of backlash. I got myself ID'd walking home from work. I was hurt by what the officer said. Let me see your ID, boy. We've been hearing things about black boys with some hoodies. Is it ethical for a cop to call me boy? It's degrading and a reference to slavery, a time in history when Black individuals were not thought of as human or equal in the eyes of the law. Robert, age 17. I'm here to tell you what I see. I hate that I have to see my brothers and sisters get killed left and right. It makes my chest hurt to know it's happening so much. I have to look over my shoulder every time I see the police. I have to take off my hoodie every time I see them drive by. I'm so scared. I'm so scared I won't live past 21. I want to live. We all do. Damien, age 18, who now is 21. 2 months after these letters were sent, George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department. After months of teaching and giving my Black and brown students agency and voice, systematic racism literally suffocated and silenced a Black man. We were in a global pandemic, and the city was literally on fire. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Martin Luther King Jr. I spent the next 2 years teaching from home and doing whatever I could to show my scholars I loved them. I continued to work with my colleagues and equity leadership team to dismantle school practices, hall passes, dress code, the bell schedule that are rooted in white supremacy. Have you ever thought how similar a school is to a prison? Racism is a white problem. It was constructed and created by white people, and the ultimate responsibility lies with white people. For too long, we've looked at it as if it were someone else's problem, as if it was created in a vacuum. Robin DiAngelo. I wasn't afraid of being controversial or challenging my principle. Anti-racist work isn't about sitting back and applauding ourselves to make us feel better. It's about reflecting on our own thoughts, actions, and working to dismantle systems that allow this institutional racism to continue. If you're comfortable, you're not doing anti-racist work. We must be comfortable with being uncomfortable. You think you're uncomfortable? Imagine how Damien feels every time he walks home. April of 2021, things seem to be getting lighter. Former officer Derek Chauvin was on trial. There seemed to be a small sense of justice, although not nearly enough to rectify the murder of Floyd. I wake up one morning to texts from former students asking if I'm okay. I was in Arizona at the time, working remotely, so I was really confused. Why were former students reaching out to me? I Googled Minneapolis. Dante Wright, a 20-year-old, fatally shot by a police officer during a traffic stop. All I could think of was Dante's goofy smile, how he'd inevitably spend the last 2 hours of his day in my room